হ্যালো স্টুডেন্টস, ওয়েলকাম টু বিএসএসইআই। বিএসএসইআই এর ইউটিউব প্ল্যাটফর্মে তোমাদের সকলকে আরও একবার স্বাগত। তোমরা জানো আমরা কয়েকদিন আগে থেকেই শুরু করেছিলাম একটি নতুন পর্ব। সেই পর্বে এনটিএ নেটের বিভিন্ন সাবজেক্টকে নিয়ে আমরা শুরু করেছি নানান লাইভ ক্লাস। তো এক এক করে আজকে আমরা যে নতুন একটি সাবজেক্ট নিয়ে চলে এসেছি, আজকের সাবজেক্ট এনটিএ নেট ইংলিশ। তোমরা থাম্বনেল দেখে ইতিমধ্যে জেনে গেছো এবং আজকে আমাদের এনটিএ নেটের ইংলিশের যে লাইভ ক্লাসটি নেবেন আমাদের বিএসএসইআই এর ছাত্রছাত্রীদের কাছে খুব প্রিয়, আর বলার অপেক্ষা রাখে না, রামপ্রসাদ স্যার। তো আমি রামপ্রসাদ স্যারকে আমাদের ইউটিউব চ্যানেলে স্বাগত জানাচ্ছি। রামপ্রসাদ স্যারকে অনুরোধ করব ক্লাসটা শুরু করার জন্য। রামপ্রসাদ স্যার।
ধন্যবাদ স্যার, thank you so much and for giving me this platform to interact with people and thank you so much অমিত স্যার। আবারও নতুন করে বলার কিছু নেই, আপনার এই সবাইকে এগিয়ে নিয়ে চলার একটা যে প্রথা আছে আপনার, সেটার জন্য আমি আন্তরিকভাবে আপনাকে ধন্যবাদ জানাচ্ছি। So the thing that we'll discuss today is a very crucial period from the perspective of NET, from the perspective of literature, from the perspective of everything that is there in the history of art, literature, psychology, sociology, philosophy, and others. That is modern period. Now, technically, this period has a particular time frame. It is like 1900 to 1945. It is roughly. You cannot just say that okay, from today or from yesterday, this modern period started or is going to be started. It's not like that. This is a process. We'll discuss how this process actually came into existence, right? Now, before we go into the core area of the modern period, we need to understand the term modern. Now, next slide. The basic terms that are related to modern period, the first term that comes to our mind is what is contemporary. What is contemporary? Then it automatically leads us towards the theory of, towards the idea of modern. And the last but not the least, the idea of modernist or modern as such. First term that I'm going to talk about is contemporary. Now, when we talk about modern, we tend to, we get to see the basic term that comes to our mind is contemporary. Now, these two terms are quite different. They are totally different to each other, different from each other. Contemporary means it is a coeval existing at the same time. I mean, two persons who are belonging to a particular age or particular time period are they modern to each other? All are not modern. Nothing with it's totally different from the style of Henry James. Henry James' idea or his
নেটওয়ার্ক সমস্যার জন্য স্যার একটু জাস্ট লিভ করে গেছেন। তো স্যার কানেক্ট হতে চেষ্টা করছেন। আমি সকলকে একটু অনুরোধ করছি অপেক্ষা করার জন্যে। স্যার খুব শিগগিরই আবার জয়েন করবেন। হ্যাঁ, স্যার শোনা যাচ্ছে?
হ্যাঁ, কতটা হয়েছিল আমি ঠিক বুঝতে পারছি না, এক্সট্রিমলি সরি।
আ স্যা আপনার 2nd স্লাইডের শুরুটার পরেই এই প্রবলেমটা হয়েছিল।
ওকে, দেন আমি সেকেন্ড স্লাইডটা শুরু থেকে আবার শুরু করছি, রাইট?
একদম।
ওকে, অমিত স্যার, সবকিছু ঠিক আছে? টেকনিক্যাল যা কিছু দেখা যাচ্ছে? মানে
হ্যাঁ, স্যার সব
এভরিথিং ইজ
ঠিক আছে।
ওকে?
আপনি শুরু একদম এভরিথিং ওকে।
ওকে, okay, fine. Now, I was talking about the idea of contemporariness. Now, contemporary means that we will existing at the same time, which means uh, suppose two characters or two individuals or two authors, they are from a specific time period, but their approach to literature, but the approach to, style, and their approach to writing are quite different from each other. The way Henry James writes is totally different from the way James Joyce writes. James Joyce's idea of literature is quite complex compared to Henry James, but they are quite contemporary to each other. They, come from a particular, they kind of exist in a particular time frame. Then they are contemporary, but they are not modern to each other in their outlook, right? Similarly, we have Walter Dillman and T.S. Eliot. They are quite contemporary to each other, but they are not modern as such. Because T.S. Eliot's idea of poetry is quite complex compared to Walter Dillman's idea of poetry. And that means being contemporary means basically it is about time. It has nothing to do, probably nothing to do with, other temperament or style or experimentation as such. Now then, how can we define this idea of modern? This leads us towards the idea of modern. Modern means breaking the traditional approach. The traditional approach means the way everybody looks at certain things, looks at certain things. um, Modern writers or modern painters or modern as such, they look those things in a different, in a kind of, with a colored glass, and this colored glass is not something decoration. That's something that has do to it has something to do with decoration. It is totally the raw. The way the things appear, modern writers, they show those things the way they appear. Okay, so traditionally it means breaking the older system and creating something new. In this idea, through this idea, we can equate the idea of make making the new by Ezra Pound and the idea of avant-garde. That means it has to do it primarily with time and secondarily, primarily with temper, sorry, primarily with temper and secondarily with time, right? Ezra Pound, T.S. Eliot, Hopkins, Yeats, they are quite modern in their outlook and their and the time period that we are talking about. Now, this leads us to the artistic development of modern period. How we can define modernist? Who is a modernist? Being modernist means it's a time of it's a matter of time, it's a matter of temper, it's a matter of technique. It has more complex devices to offer. It has a digressive plot structure. It has several narrative techniques. It is polyphonic in nature. It is heteroglossy. Everything. That means the ultimate person who kind of experiments with the genre, with the style, with the language, with other things, with the syntax, with other things that are associated with literature, and that person is called, can be called, a modernist. That way we can identify the writings of Virginia Woolf, T.S. Eliot, and James Joyce. They are modernist specifically, right? Next slide. In the next slide, I am going to discuss how, minutely, T.S. Eliot has described the idea of modern through his approach to, poetry. In a poem called Cousin Nancy, he says, Miss Nancy Ellicott smoked and danced all the modern dances, and her aunts were not quite sure how they felt about it, but they knew that it was modern. That means Nancy Ellicott, she danced all the modern dances she knew, right? But her aunts were not quite sure what she was dancing, but they felt something new about it, something modern about it. They didn't understand the form, but they got the idea that it is something to do with newness. That is modern. The kind of obscurity associated with modern, literature or modern art is the thing of newness, is the thing of breaking the old tradition and creating something new. I mean, the idea of all change utterly and the terrible beauty is born. The idea of terrible beauty is modern, right? Now, next slide. In the next slide, I'm going to discuss how Ezra Pound has minutely observed this modern through through the idea of imagism in a kind of haiku poem. It's not exactly a haiku poem, but we can say that the style is quite associated, can be associated with haiku. The lines go like this. The apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on wet black bough. Now, Ezra Pound, obviously, it has, much to offer, not only imagism or symbolism. It is about how a person observes people. The setting of the poem is a metro station, which is in France. I mean Paris, to be very particular. When Ezra Pound was writing this particular poem, the apparition of these faces in the crowd. He said that the metro is actually going through the subway, and all the people, they're running. Nobody could understand what they are running for, why they are running for, and who are they. They were just running, and the image that struck in his mind was like the image of a kind of plant that is going to die, and it has a black bough, and there are some petals with, and the petals are wet. The image totally describes the idea of futurism. Not only so, the idea of how modern people are running after things, running after material issues, and they kind of they tend to forget the simple lifestyle that are associated with it, with their lives, right? So how, in the next slide, I'm going to discuss how uh, modern period can be, identified through a particular time frame. How can we kind of say that from this particular age, or from this particular time, or from this particular year, this modern period probably came to be came into existence. that is December 1910. And during that period, according to Virginia Woolf, human character changed. Why this human character changed? Because everybody was looking for something that is new. Everybody was looking after the newness. And, nobody was interested in the traditional outlook. So that is there in Virginia Woolf's idea of modern. Now, in the next slide, how Ezra Pound has said that modern means we have to make something new. The idea of make it new came into existence in 1914, right? Now, some of the observations that I have gathered from my understanding of modern period, and I have just noted those things down here. And the first thing that struck my mind was contemporary poet is not necessarily a modern, and a modern poet is not necessarily a modernist, that I was talking about in the earlier slide. Now, why this modern period is very important? Because it depicts the distorted reality. It depicts the fragmentation, though it doesn't kind of celebrate that, unlike postmodernists. But yes, they depict the rawness, the flawed beauty of the society, right? And they kind of rejected any kind of flashy decoration. And that way we can understand from the lines of WBS Eastern 1916, all change utterly, the terrible beauty is born. The terrible beauty is this oxymoronic term, has everything to do with modernism and the fragmentation that I'm talking about. Now, the next thing that I'm talking about is the less is more, the idea of less is more, the idea of minimalism, that how minimalism is quite, instrumental in understanding the modern art, because modern art doesn't depict everything. It specifies how to look at things from a particular perspective, right? So it doesn't, include everything. Unlike other romantic, it obviously rejects the romantic exuberance that I'm going to discuss in my understanding of Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, right? The use of free verse obviously is in poetry is very important to understand modern poetry. The experimentation with style, genre, syntax, language, etc. I'm kind of rushing a bit because I'm running out of time. Experimentation with style, genre, syntax, and language is there in modern period. Now, how this process is a process came into existence, how this thing happened, this modernism happened. It didn't happen overnight, right? Through certain change, through certain people, it came into existence. First was Darwin's book The Origin of Species paved probably the way to flourish the modern art. He kind of destabilized. You have to understand why I'm talking about destabilization, because there is no stability in the modern period. So you have to destabilize the existing norms. You have to kind of break the existing norms. So Darwin broke the existing norm that was God was there in everything. He questioned the idea of God. Now, I mean, everybody kind of questioned the way they kind of approached life. Darwin questioned the idea of God, and he destabilized the biological world. Karl Marx, he destabilized the social world after the publication of Das Kapital and Communist Manifesto. Freud destabilized the mental world because of his understanding of unconscious and the interpretation of dreams, the two books that are important in understanding the psychological world. Bergson, he destabilized the temporal world, and his idea of elan vital or vital force, through this idea of vital force, he kind of destabilized the temporal world. Nietzsche destabilize the metaphysical world, and I'm going to talk about Nischay in probably the penultimate slide, right? Albert Einstein, he destabilized the physical world through his idea of relativity, and thus all of them were creating a space for modern art, the so-called art quid that I'm going to talk about, and literature to happen, right? So next slide, right? Important events that occurred during the modern period. First, obviously, the World War One that happened during 1914 to 1918, then Russian Bolshevik Revolution in 1918, then establishment of Irish Free State in 1922, and the idea, I mean, the year 1922 is very important from the perspective of literature because Wasteland was published in 1922, and our Ulysses was published also during 1992. Aaron's Rod was published in 1992, and Jacob's Room also published in 1922. So many things are happening during 1922. So it is also very important from the perspective of literature, right? Next is the collapse of American Stock Exchange. This is called the Great Depression. It happened during 1929 and it continued till 1930. And there is a very famous essay by uh, the American writer. I'm forgetting the name of the writer. It's called The Crack Up by The Crack Up, right? The name of the essay is Crack Up. I'm forgetting the name of the author, right? Then the Spanish Civil War that happened during 1936, then the Second World War, then 1939 to 1945, and the end of the Second World War after dropping the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. We all know those things, the historical events. Okay, next slide. Important invention and developments during that period. The emergence of visible and invisible communications such as photography, cinema, telephone, telegraphy, wireless, which resulted in the rapid transmission of news, ideas, and images. Everything was happening during that period. And experimentation was at its peak. The discovery of X-rays and radium, and we can find the reference of X-ray in the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock by T.S. Eliot, right? When there was a line in the poem, it goes like this: "It is impossible to say just what I mean, as if a magic lantern threw the nerves in patterns on a screen." The magic lantern is nothing but X-ray that T.S. Eliot was talking about. Now, talking about T.S. Eliot in the next slide, and here I'm going to talk about the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, the magnum opus of T.S. Eliot, and how this poem is very experimental, obviously, and instrumental in understanding modern period or modern poetry as such. So, in the poem, as you can understand, that the title is very, it's not so conventional. It is not traditional. It is not a love song of Tom, Dick, Harry. It is not love song of Rahul from the perspective of Indian, but it is a love song of J. Alfred Prufrock. The idea, the name also gives us an impression. No, this is not going to be a traditional love song. It is something different from the traditional romantic love song that we kind of get to see in romantic poetry. So use of free verse is also there because free verse is very useful in modern poetry also, because we can see that there are plenty of free verses are used in modern poetry. The poem begins like this: "Let us go, then you and I, when the evening is spread out against the sky, like a patient etherized upon a table." Now, we can see that when the poem begins, it gives us an impression that, oh, this is going to be a very romantic poem that we get to see in romantic period. No, this romantic exuberance is immediately debunked or cut by T.S. Eliot through his idea of, incorporating the lines like a patient etherized upon a table. We are not in a world where people are kind of celebrating their love. We are in a kind of world, in a kind of society where everybody is dying. So it is like we are living in a city, and how can we kind of express our emotions the way Wordsworth and Coleridge did? Because we are in a life that is very fragmented, that is very, that is in ruin, right? That is in ruins. Okay. The use of interior monologue is also there in the poetry of modern period. The image of an anesthetized day projects not only the sickness of modern civilization, but also the psychic inertia that cripples to folk that I was talking about during the patient etherized upon a table. Right now, um, in the next slide, here I'm going to talk about a very important text by James Joyce. It is called a portrait of the artist as a young man. Now, unlike all the novels, this novel has something more to offer. This is not quite traditional in its approach, in its outlook, in its technique, in its, expression, because it is going to be a portrait of the artist as a young man. Who is a young man? The protagonist of the novel is Stephen Dedalus, and we can immediately associate the all know that how he is very close and he is waxed. Yes, sir. Oof, just a minute. হ্যাঁ দেখা যাচ্ছে হ্যালো
হ্যাঁ স্যার, স্টার্ট করুন।
ওকে কতটা হয়েছিল বলুন তো এই পোর্ট্রেট ওকে ফাইন okay fine the novel is quite experimental from the perspective of modern and it has more to offer unlike the traditional novels. The protagonist of the novel is Stephen Dedalus, we all know, and he the moment we hear the name Stephen Dedalus, okay okay is it okay now
হ্যাঁ স্যার, স্টার্ট করুন।
Okay, fine. Extremely sorry, because of the network problem. So yes, I was talking about how James Joyce actually clubbed two things together. One is, I mean, Stephen, the religious prophet, and Daedalus, the greater artist, the great artist. And in order to, I mean, understand his, the modern life, he showed the development of the life of Stephen Dedalus through some, through some experiences, through his experiences, we got to see, got to understand the modern period better, or the society in a, in an experimental way. So the novel is also very experimental from the perspective of modern. It is a stream of consciousness of a child. It begins with a fairy tale kind of thing, but it is not like so. It begins like this. Once upon a time, and a very good time it was, there was a muko coming down along the road, and the muko that was coming down along the road met a innocent little boy named Baby Tuku. His father told him that story. Now, this is how a fairy tale begins, right? Once upon a time, there was a king, there was a queen. This is how a fairy tale begins. It is the psychology of a child to understand fairy tale, and by understanding the fairy tale, he kind of gets to sleep. But this novel, the way it, emerges, it develops the psychology of the child, the growth of the child, the mental stability of the child, everything, right? With the passage of time, we get to see how he becomes an artist, and his sensuousness is very is shown in such a way that we get to see, or get to understand the sensuousness of a child from from a simplistic manner. It goes like this. When you wet the bed, there is an incident in the novel when the child is when he is kind of something grown up, right? When you this is the interior monologue of the child. He says, Stephen Nedler says, the child says, when you wet the bed, first it is warm, then it gets cold. His mother put on the oil sheet that had the queer smell. That had the queer smell. Now, he didn't know what happened because he peed. He urinated his bed. Because he was a child, he didn't understand. But he understood through his sensuousness that at first it was kind of warm. Then, with the passage of time, I felt something cold there. So this is how we get to understand the psychology of a child. So you can see that experimentation was also happening from the psychological world also, right? And okay, experimentation of the language also, and symbolism is also there. The wild rose, green place is associated with Ireland, and wild rose is associated with the wild beauty here that the artist was actually searching for. Okay, because I'm running out of time, I'll kind of rush a bit. In the next slide, imagism, I'm going to talk about some isms that flourished during that period in the field of architecture and in the field of paintings. The first thing that I'm going to talk about is imagism, and all these isms, eventually paved the way to flourish the modern art, or modern, literature, right? So everybody, or every ism, was actually questioning the traditional belief or traditional outlook. Because if you do not question the traditional outlook, if you do not be skeptic a bit, then you will not learn. The more you question, the more you learn. Because we all know there is a very famous song in Rock On by Farhan Akhtar. It goes like this. आसमां है नीला क्यों, पानी गीला गीला क्यों, गोल क्यों है जमीन, सोचा है, सोचा नहीं तो सोचो अभी. If you haven't given a thought to it, it is the right time, because you have to practice the art of thinking. As we all know, Ritik Ghatok said, "Bhabo, bhaba practice karo." We have to think, and this idea of thinking and this idea of questioning was happening in all the levels during that period, during the modern period. The first ism that I'm going to talk about is imagism. It deals with imagery, as goes with the term. It deals with clear, sharp language. Then this imagery this imagism eventually paved the way to, this imagism eventually got incorporated into the field of poetry, right? As we got to see from the poems of Ezra Pound, how minimal he was in using words, but through using certain words, he expressed a lot. The apparition of those faces in the crowd, the petals on a wet black bough. With those minimal words, he created an aura of everything. He created how he explored everything. He wanted us to understand everything, and we got to know that. Now, imagism, it deals with obviously imagery, clear, sharp language, and it rejected the romantic sentiment. Unlike Wordsworthian, powerful emotion. Expression of powerful emotion. I'm not exactly getting the line right now. The use of free verse also there in the poetry of imagism, in the imagist poetry. It actually happened during 1914 to 1917, and the famous anthology that came into existence during that period was the Imagiste, or the Imagist. It is an anthology where this imagism, or the issues related to imagism, are incorporated, right? And poetries are written during those period, and the poetry are written during those period. Major figures of imagism are, poetry of imagism are Hilda Doolittle, Ford Madoc Ford, William Carlos Williams, T. Holm, right? Okay. Then we talk about symbolism. Symbolism, and this is a painting by Edward Monk, and the name of the painting is The Okay. Then Russia, then Belgium, and it was trying to understand art through symbols and metaphors, as goes with the name, symbolism. It also rejected the ideas of realism and naturalism, right? Naturalism by Emile Zola and all. All right. Okay. Then, yes, the main exponent of symbolism in literature was Baudelaire. Baudelaire's collection of poetry called Flowers of Evil, which was published in 1857, it paved the way to flourish symbolism. Then the Symbolist Manifesto, which was a French newspaper, and exponents of symbolism are Baudelaire, Mallarmé, Paul Valéry. These are the leading figures of symbolism, and other figures, obviously T.S. Eliot, Arthur Rimbaud, etc., etc. Now, Vorticism. Vorticism is obviously an art movement that flourished in London during 1914. It was actually formed by Wyndham Lewis, and the image is called kind of Dancer by Wyndham Lewis. It deals with kind of abstract art and cubism. It was partially inspired by cubism, and I'll talk about cubism in a later slide, right? And it gives the emphasis on modern life, and bold lines in the play. I mean, in the painting, those bold lines play a crucial role in understanding the modern life, right? Expressionism. Expressionism that I was talking about while I was talking about Edward Monk. In this slide, expressionism, I'll be talking about how this painting by this Ernst Kirchner, it was called Self-Portrait of a Soldier, as a soldier, and it was a self-portrait of Kirchner when he was coming from the war, and you can see that one of his arms is kind of amputated, his right hand is quite amputated, and there is a lady background, and he is kind of smoking a cigarette and loosely. The way everything I mean is put together as a whole, and the way the expression of particular of the figures are important to understand how this particular figure of Kirchner was very much disillusioned by the I mean, the destruction of war. He came from the war, and it was in his mind. He was understanding, or he was, searching for the meaning why war was happening or war happened, right? So it is about that that expression that the officer has to offer. In drama, Eugene O'Neill and August Strindberg, Sean O'Shea, Tennessee Williams, Arthur Miller, Samuel Beckett, they are the major dramatists who kind of experimented with the idea of expressionism. Now, in the next slide, I'm talking about, I'll be talking about futurism. Futurism, which has actually originated in Italy, and from two major exponents of futurism were Filippo Marinetti and Luigi Russolo. Filippo Marinetti is the manifesto of futurism, and Luigi Russolo, the art of noises, are very instrumental in understanding futurism. And as the term goes, it deals with how our future is going to be, how the development like science and technology, industrialism, city life, and dynamism, everything gives us an impression how our future is going to be. And this is actually a painting by Umberto Bosini, and the name of the painting is Dynamism of a Cyclist. And you can see here two cyclists are there. They are running to different directions, and the way they are running, all the lines in the painting, they describe the speed that this futurism is going to offer, right? Surrealism is a very well-known term in literature, in paintings, in art, and in cinema also. Recently, there was a very famous cinema by Srijit Mukherjee in Bengali called Nirbak, which used issues like surrealism. And there was a kind of surreal dance by Susmita Sen in one of the scenes in the film, right? So surrealism, it actually originated during World War I, and it influenced by Dadaism. It is known for paintings and writings. it deals with the dream, and it deals with the reality, the super reality that I mean one um, understands, or one observes through the understanding of the reality, right? The main leader of surrealism is Andre Breton, and the term surrealism is not given by Andre Breton. It was coined by William Aliponaire, a French art critic and a poet, right? And what Andre Breton says about surrealism is something like this. He says that to resolve the previously contradictory conditions of dream and reality into an absolute reality, a super reality or surreality, through this understanding of dreams and reality, when they converge together and the way they flourish, this is kind of a surreality or super reality. That is surrealism that I'm going to talk about. This is a very famous sculpture by Marshall Duchamp. It is called the Fountain. When he kind of presented that in an art exhibition in New York, they rejected primarily, but because he kind of paid the fees for the exhibition, they had to accept it, and they kind of I mean, put the sculpture in a separate gallery. But ultimately, there was a there was a photographer who kind of took the photo, and then it got a wide publicity, and people accepted that how one can come up with an urinal. This is kind of blasphemous, right? You cannot show something that is problematic, that is unconventional, that is kind of unacceptable. That is the thing that experimentation has to do with. Experimentation says that you have to be very uncomfortable to understand art, and this is the kind of uncomfortable the sense of uncomfortability that Marshall Duchamp was trying to offer. He said, no, I am not going to paint something that is traditional, or I'm going to not going to create something that is traditional. I am going to make everybody uncomfortable to see the way everybody, this is quite familiar with everybody's life, but they didn't accept it because it doesn't go with the norms. But everybody ultimately had to accept it because it is something avant-garde. It is something new. The epicenter of Dadaism was in Zurich, and they rejected the traditional logic and reason that and aestheticism that modern capitalist society has to offer. Next slide, I'm going to talk about Cubism. Cubism, as the name goes, it depicts the fragmentation through cube-like structures in paintings. As you can see, this is a very famous painting by Pablo Picasso, and here you can see that all the the figure is quite disfigured. The way the figure is presented is quite not traditional, right? It is an art movement in sculpture and painting and literature also. It represents the broken cube-like existence of the modern life that I was talking about in the earlier slides. The painter represents the objects from multitudes of viewpoints. It is a kind of 3D effect that this painting offers, right? Um, this idea of cubism came into existence through two ideas. One is Orphism, and another one is abstract art. It deals with the 3D representation, and the major figures of cubism are Pablo Picasso and George Burks and Joan Gris, right? Now, while talking about Picasso, how can we forget his masterpiece, Guernica? That was eventually came out in eventually came out in 1937 after the bombing um, in Guernica, is a town in Spain, and the bombing was actually done by Nazi member and fascists of that particular period. So in Guernica, what is happening? the experimentation was totally at its peak. This is probably the first. This is probably the first overtly political painting by Pablo Picasso. I am going to see how this painting as a whole is incomplete. If we look at the painting is something that I have put in as a big whole, right? But there are two smaller sheets that are there below the painting. These two sheets are called the dream of Lie Franco. Sorry, the dream and lie of Franco. The dream and lie of Franco. There's a character called Franco, and through this sequential narrative, or the way Pablo Picasso imagined Franco, he experimented with the idea of painting, the way we look at painting, right? We look at painting from left to right, or read or write everything kind of left to right until and unless there is a different manner in writing. Probably in Arabic there is a right to left kind of sequence is there. But I'm just talking about the traditional approach. We approach an art or a book from left to right is the Z kind of pattern that we follow. So here, the kind of sequentiality we can see, or we can observe through these sheets that I have put below the painting, right? There, the characters are disfigured. But, Pablo Picasso, he took some individual panels from this draft called Dream and Lie of Franco, and he picked some individual characters from the draft, ultimately placed those panels or placed those figures into the painting Guernica. That is how it came into existence. So you can see how he was imagining the art as a tradition, not as a traditional artist. He was imagining the art as an experiment. As an artist who experiments with art, as an artist who understands art or observes art very minutely. So it deals with two things also. One is cubism, another one is surrealism. You can see some cube-like figures. Cube-like figures are also there in the painting, and some images or some figures which are inspired from surrealist understanding are also there in the painting. So you can see that the experimentation was also happening in the field of art and in the field of painting. He was not dealing with the traditional approach, right? So in this slide, I am going to talk about how everybody, each and every figure of literature or art or painting or kind of sculpture, they paved the way to flourish this modern art to happen. The kind of earthquake that is going to happen, how this earthquake was eventually happening during the modern period. Slightly kind of, before the modern period, we get to see how Sigmund Freud was experimenting with the psychological world. When he was dealing with the ideas like libido or regression or ego superhero and other understanding, he was destabilizing or he was experimenting with the psychological world, with the mental world, right? The libido, which is kind of sexual drive that I mean Sigmund Freud was talking about, was saying, it has to. I mean, he says that an individual, when he is born, or when an individual is born, he or she, whatever, when an individual is born, he has to go through 5 stages in order to gain experience or gather experience. These 5 stages can be divided into can be given some terms like oral, phallic, oral, anal, phallic, latin, and genital, right? Oral, anal, phallic, latin, and genital, these 5 terms. And ultimately that individual could understand and the world in a better way, right? So that was his idea. He was experimenting with the mental world, psychological domain. Now, when he was talking about the term called regression, he was actually dealing with the idea of, I mean, defense mechanism that an individual deals with in day-to-day life. And we all know the idea of ego, superego, right? I'm not going to talk about those things in detail because people know those things. My idea, point was to show or to locate how everybody was creating something new to um, to showcase a new kind of area, to locate a new kind of area, to create a new kind of area, that is the modern period. So next I'm going to talk about Albert Einstein's theory of relativity. There is nothing new to talk about. In the next thing that Locke was talking about, he said that our mind is like a tabula rasa. And he said in his essay, very famous essay called An Essay Concerning Human Understanding, which was published in 1690. Locke's idea of tabula rasa goes like this. He said that our mind is like a blank slate. When an individual is born, there is nothing but, I mean, blankness, darkness. Not exactly darkness. There is nothing in human mind. But this idea is challenged by Carl Jung when he wrote the essay called Structure of the Unconscious. So you can see that experimentation was also happening in the theoretical level also, in the theoretical level, right? Because he was challenging the idea of tabula rasa. He said, Carl Jung said, no, human mind is not a blank slate. There are so many things an individual is is born with when he is born, when an individual is born, he or she. So he said that when an individual is born, he is born with some collective unconscious, which is quite different from Freud's idea of unconscious, which Carl Jung said the personal unconscious. Carl Jung said that when an individual is born, he is born with collective unconscious. Now, what is this collective unconscious? This collective unconscious is nothing but the mental, shared mental experiences that an individual uh, kind of can equate with another individual. Like the way we can understand things through some, according to Carl Jung, through some archetypes or symbols. What are these archetypes? He said that those archetypes are like the tree of life, the great mother, etc., etc. Right? So through these archetypes, we can gather experience, and these gathered or shared experiences are called the collective unconscious. Now, when we are talking about collective unconscious, we how can we deny the effect of Nietzsche's ideas like God is dead, or Amor Fati, or Overmarch, or eternal return, or nihilism, etc., etc. So God is dead is quite familiar. I mean, people are quite familiar with the idea of God is dead. Nietzsche said that there is nothing for God in the temporal world, which he actually said in the essay called The Gay Science. Then it got popular in the book called Thus Spake Zarathustra. And the idea of Amor Fati, called the love of fate, when an individual sees or understands one's fate and or suffering, and he kind of accepts or rejects, not exactly rejects, kind of loves that that is suffering, or the fate that is written or woven in his life. So the love of fate is called Amor Fati, that Mr. was talking about. Then Ubermensch, called his idea of Ubermensch, called superior human being, when a human being becomes kind of different from the traditional belief, and he goes beyond the traditional belief, and he becomes superior to the traditional human man, I mean human being. Then this idea of Ubermensch is I mean comes into existence, right? Then the idea of eternal return or eternal recurrence. He says that over an infinite period of time, everything occurs infinitely or ad infinitum. There is no possibility how an individual, or how an existence is going to be recurred. How many times is going to be recurred? It is like a cyclic process. It is like endless process. This endless process is called eternal recurrence or eternal recur, right? Eternal return. Then nihilism, which is quite familiar with the idea of nothingness, that I mean how one understands the kind of life or the society that modern life is I mean, happening. It is quite nothing. So this idea of nihilism is like nothingness. So in the picture, I have shown how personal, I mean, unconscious is different from collective unconscious. The personal unconscious that Sigmund Freud was talking about is totally different from the collective unconscious, which can be understood from some archetypes and I mean symbols, and which is given by Carl Jung. So these are there, and apart from those, the main writers that emerged before the effect of modernism were Walt Whitman, whose book Leaves of Grass, which was published during 1955 to it continued to 1855 to 1891. Then Baudelaire's, that I was talking about in the earlier slide, Flowers of Evil or Flowers du Mal, in it was published in 1857. Arthur Rimbaud, whose Illuminations came out in 1874. Then Strindberg's A Dream Play in 1902. Damascus, 1898. Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, 1866. So these are the major writers who experimented first, who showed a different kind of idea, and through their ideas, this modern period eventually was coming to flourish. So this is how we can, I mean, understand modern period. Thank you. So this is like a brief understanding of modern period. So thank you so much, everyone, for listening to me. Yes.